Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, and I'm your host, John Johnson. And in this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about codependency. It's a huge topic, and it affects many people. Codependency, an example of that would be if you have an individual who, for some reason, grew up, and a lot of codependency issues are rooted in their childhood. Grew up being a caretaker. Let's say you've got a parent who became widowed or a widower, and the child sort of takes on a role of being a partner to the parent. Now, I don't mean in some sort of incestuous way, but I just mean that there's things that happen in a household that now a child is given a certain set of responsibilities that doesn't necessarily become, or actually it wasn't part of their childhood duties. Because kids grow up, they play, they ride their bicycles, and they do all kinds of things. But they may get thrust into the role of being more of an adult. And when you grow up in that experience, then you tend to carry those things into your adulthood. So if you're a child that grew up taking care of siblings, and you may not have experienced your own childhood, so your response to experiences that you have later on in life would be a reflection of that. For example, as a child, it may have been your responsibility to see that all matters were taken care of, say in the kitchen. As you grow up, when you are in, let's say, a work environment, and you notice something is not being handled, you may swoop in and solve that, even though that is somebody else's responsibility. Now, you've sort of expanded your duties. You probably felt that it was your job to be responsible to take care of all of these things. And as a child, it would have been. But when you become an adult, in a workplace, let's say, we all have our roles. But if you're constantly stepping in and taking on things that are beyond your description, you are probably doing it out of codependency. Now, there's those that are trying to do it because they're trying to get a promotion. They're trying to learn things. But this isn't from that perspective. This is from the perspective that somehow you feel responsible to do this, and your compulsion is to constantly step in. That's probably codependency. That would explain this. The danger, if I can use that word, the problem with codependency is that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's self-care going on. Because if you're constantly extending yourself to do all of these other things, your own needs are probably not being taken care of. And that's the problem with codependency. There is the self-neglect. And it's not always apparent. Sometimes codependency becomes a thing in which you take care of somebody else's needs so far ahead of your own that you're not only blind to it, but in some cases, you know you have your own needs, but you get the validation by taking care of someone else's. If this fits who you are or who you have been or the direction that you're going, we're talking codependency, and it requires some skills. Usually cognitive therapy would help one recognize the things that are happening and to begin to change that. And again, this usually becomes an issue because of the lack of self-care, meaning if you have a health issue and you're not taking care of your own, but you're insisting on helping somebody else deal with theirs, can you see that there's a disconnect here? You really have to be present to your own needs. And as I have shared, you can't really take care of someone else until you've learned to take care of yourself. That's the benefit of self-care. You can use that to learn how to be supportive, learn how to help direct someone else to be mindful about their own issues, and maybe even give some friendly advice. But if you're neglecting yourself, then you're probably not the best example of someone to how to do that and be complete with that. So again, the issue of codependency is large. Many people suffer from it, and in various forms. And I've just talked about something very simply, but you can use your imagination and see how far that this can go. So again, if that's you, then it's something you want to be mindful of. You can look for it in yourself, in your significant other. And if you happen to have children and you're asking your children to do things beyond the role of where kids should be, just consider what their lives are going to be like because of this influence, and be the role of the parent that you're supposed to be. And it's great to teach your kids things because it's from the parents that kids are going to learn, and it's valuable. But there's also that line that you can approach, but you shouldn't cross, and understand what codependency is, how it comes about, and you can begin to raise your kids and allow them to still be kids. And we'll be right back after this break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. I'm your host, John Johnson, and this is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And I want to talk a little bit about something called the halo effect. I want to cite my source here, and it's Wikipedia. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which an observer's overall impression of a person, a company, or a brand influence the observer's feelings and thoughts about that entity's character or properties. And it was named by psychologist Edward Thorndike in reference to a person being perceived as having a halo. Now, let me explain that. Many of us, when we look at an individual, we perceive that individual as being great. We love them. We think that they just walk on water and they can do no wrong. That is sort of the idea of the halo effect, and we don't necessarily see them as they are. All human beings have flaws. That's just how it is. We are human. But when we don't necessarily see that and understand that about an individual, we may give them status and also have expectations of them that should not be there. And the point of a relationship, when you don't see a person for who they are, and let's say you give them way too much credit, if you're involved with a person who happens to be toxic, and that's the direction I'm going to take this, when they have the halo effect, you don't see that toxicity. You may make excuses for it and tend to explain it away, but it becomes one of those, I don't want to use the word phenomena, but it becomes a condition of looking at somebody but not in reality. And as a person, when you are in a relationship with somebody, you have to understand that they're human beings. They make mistakes. And those of us that make mistakes, and I'm definitely one who makes mistakes. I have a long list of those things. But when we look at humans as making mistakes and then trying to learn from them, that is much more realistic. That is a person who you can be in an experience with and appreciate them for who they are, because they then are going to be much more realistic and more practical about things. But when you see the person and have this halo effect experience with them, then you fail to see them for who they are. If they're an individual who has passed away, for example, or here's an example of something that happens with this halo effect. When there has been a breakup in the relationship and you tend to have idolized that significant other, when the breakdown happens, when the relationship ends for whatever reason, and we tend to pine away waiting for that person to come back, or keep wishing for them to come back, or keep trying to work at that, sometimes we forget that the relationship ended, or forget why the relationship ended. And it could have been because it was their toxic behavior that caused this. And it's important to take note of that, so that when you reconnect, you're not still repeating the same old patterns. See, the halo effect gives an individual the perception, again, I've said this, the halo effect gives the perception that the other person is almost perfect, that they can do no wrong. That's not healthy. It's not healthy to think of another individual that way, and it's certainly not healthy for a person to present themselves as being perfect. You can't work with that. That's not a partnership that's going to work for you. That's going to eventually come back to bite you, because these kinds of individuals oftentimes don't take accountability for themselves and the consequences for things that happen as a result of that kind of behavior. And when you idolize people to the extent that this can go, then you yourself can be doing harm. And it is something that you would need help with. Hopefully you have people in your experience that would try to comfort you during a time of loss. When a relationship breaks up, obviously it can be very emotionally devastating. But the thing that happens to all of us is there is a change in how we feel. But some of these decisions about what to do next can't necessarily be made in that instant. Sometimes you need to take a break, step back, think about it, understand why the change happened, and if this is a time when you need to transition, you need to end that relationship, end that association, and move on to someone else, time is usually what it takes. And there's lots of help out there to deal with those transitions. But if you wonder why it is that if you're a person who has experienced this and you have this thing that sort of washes over you where you just idolize this person, that's a way of describing it. It's called the halo effect. And when you don't see any wrong with who they are and what they're doing, oh boy, you're in for a ride. And something else I'd want to kind of mention that sort of makes me think about this is anxiety. Now, anxiety is sort of a restlessness or feeling wound up on edge, being easily fatigued. If you have difficulty in concentrating, something like that, it's anxiety kind of describes it. And it could be general. It could be about very specific things. And when it's even more intense, say if you have a fear of going in an elevator, there could be, claustrophobia, which describes the fear of being in close places. But there can be some anxiety about going into a situation which you may have to ride an elevator or an escalator or something. That helps to describe it, the feeling. And if that's yourself, if you've never understood it, the word that we use to describe that feeling is anxiety. And there are many ways to treat that. There could be cognitive help, which is what a therapist would do. And therefore, if you have an understanding of what the anxiety is and what might be causing it, and sometimes knowing that you have that fear, you might avoid what it is that would cause the anxiety or the experience. Meaning if you have to go on an elevator, you might avoid going on elevators or an escalator. And in those cases, some of those things may preclude you from actually enjoying your life. And that's one of the problems with anxiety, is that it prevents you from being able to engage in life. Now, what it started to talk about was being treated for that. It could be doctors can help you with that. There could be medications that can help reduce your anxiety, because in some cases you may have heart palpitations, you may have sweating, you may have difficulty breathing. You can feel a lot of these kinds of feelings. This isn't just something that's operationally, your body's just not going to be in normal mode. It's going to be hyped up, and you're going to have difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating. So all of these are possible symptoms that could be related to the anxiety, and being able to treat that will help you get back to a normal way of life. And that's what I want to see happen for you. So if you're experiencing those things, contact a health professional. They can get you treated. I can share a personal story of my own. For a long time, and at various times, I had an issue with going on elevators, and it was a claustrophobia kind of thing. And it was something that happened in my childhood. It was in a closed space. It's kind of trapped in the enclosed space and couldn't get out. And it was just some kids, they were playing, and it gave me quite a fright. Well, the thing about elevators obviously surfaced many, many, many years later. And it was me kind of taking things apart and figuring out that was part of the cause. I also at one time had a problem with being flying. Now, as much as I love airplanes, you can't love airplanes and want to be around them and then not be able to fly them, because that sort of defeats the whole thing. At least in my particular case, it was. So it took quite a bit of work for me to be comfortable being in an airplane. And I'm talking small planes, light planes, where I was trying to take a few flying lessons and learn how to control the thing and keep wings level, so to speak. But imagine being in a place where you love something so much, but you can't take part in it because of the anxiety and the fear that comes up around it. So it does impact your life or a person's life, and dealing with those things can improve the quality of your life. In the experience of my own, being able to actually go up in an airplane and fly it was the highlight of the month for me, because I had a grin on my face as wide as it had ever been, and everything else in the world in terms of my problems seemed small. They seemed like I could conquer them. But because I was able to overcome that fear long enough to be able to fly that airplane and land it. Now, this is sort of a non sequitur. I'm just kind of waxing on a lot of things here, and it just came to mind. And it is the idea of bullying. And we've grown up with some concepts that we have later come to define as not being really nice things to each other. Hazing, harassing people, and just doing it for fun, or what we perceive to be the person who's doing the harassing thinks it's fun. We have come to find out has had the effect on the person who is the target of that it hurts them. And we've defined these things as being bullying. Well, I'm just going to share a little bit of information. There is a website called stopbullying.gov, stopbullying.gov, and it talks about the subject. It talks about what is bullying, cyberbullying, who is at risk, preventing bullying, and so on. You can go onto that website. And I'm bringing attention to this. It's not just a relationship subject, but it is something that desires, I think, the attention of people, because it sometimes happens right in front of us, and we feel sometimes powerless to stop. Well, a website like this covers this topic very well. I've read it, and I wanted to share it with you so that you as a listener, if you have the opportunity to go on it, please do. And there are a lot of things you can do. If you're a parent of a child who has experienced this, I'm sure that you ache for your kid. I have being a kid once, I've obviously experienced some sort of taunting and harassing, but I don't think I experienced it to the point where some children who are reduced to tears and feel afraid of going to school and those kinds of things. That's obviously what this is designed to do, is to help prevent those kinds of events in people's lives, because it impacts them. It impacts them, and it changes them. What we've come to learn about a lot of the behaviors that result from children being bullied is they then become aggressive. Some of them become aggressive. Some of them aren't that, clearly, but when they become the aggressive type, and because they've having felt oppressed, and they become a danger to the rest of us, a lot of people become victims of that person who was bullied. And you never know what you do and how it can affect someone. When you're mean, you never know how it can affect somebody later on. So certainly, I'm all for kindness. I believe it. And I think there's a lot of things you can do in showing love and kindness to people. And I hope that that's the kind of message that I'm giving. But if you're a person who has been affected by this, by the bullying, it is something that you can get help with. There are people that want to do something for you in your behalf. And I think one of the things to do is if you're feeling bullied, you should say something to your attacker if you have the courage to be able to do so. Sometimes you are just paralyzed. Sometimes people don't know that you're being hurt by their actions. And for those, when they get the message and they stop, certainly we can make it a new day. But those people who don't want to yield and respect your space and your boundaries, they have to be called on it. They have to be taken to task. And you might feel safer when you know that there are people out there who are willing to take on that with you. There are lots of public service announcements that relate to this on television and radio and advertisements and so on and so forth, billboard ads. So if you are the subject of something like that, please reach out, get help, get some assistance, and make this a different day for you. And I'll be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. You are listening to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I am your host, John Johnson. And I'm going to touch on something a little bit. It's about death, and it affects us all. We've all known somebody or been related to someone that has passed away. And, depending upon your culture, how you approach death could be anywhere from it's a part of life and understanding it from that standpoint, and others have a much more difficult time with it. It's a very touchy subject for a lot of us, because there could be the sudden death, so losing someone, say in a car accident, or maybe someone who suddenly became ill, and there could be those that have suffered a long-term illness. And with that, sometimes it seems that death is a relief because they are no longer part of the suffering. But what happens to those that are left behind when a loved one dies or someone that you know dies? And that can be multifaceted. For some, it is a very painful experience. There's a sense of feeling alone, and in that you feel very lost, because there could be a lot of feelings associated with that person who they may have been a mentor. They could have been somebody that you were very dependent upon, emotionally, economically, and now you have to go forward. Those are very gut-wrenching things to experience. And if you're somebody who is in that place, then my heart goes out to you for your loss, and to then have to put your life back together to function. And when you are in that place, you may not know where to turn. Hopefully, you have someone who is nearby who is willing to extend a hand. I would hope that you would feel open to allowing them to help you. If you belong to a social group, a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, a temple, whatever it is that is in your lifestyle, I would hope that you will allow those people to be a comfort to you, because it is a time when you could certainly use that help, that assistance, to get over the emotional turmoil that you're going to be going through, experiencing a death. I myself, my mother passed away a few years ago, and I was certainly in autopilot mode to deal with putting together her service and sharing her passing with family members in dealing with some of their grief. And it took quite a while before I began to face my own. But my mother had done a very good job of preparing me for life, and I felt very blessed to have had her be my mother, so that I could then be the man that I was for her in her space, and to honor her at her service, and to have the many people that showed up to pay their respects. But again, I was fortunate. Those that are not in that position, well, it's about knowing where to turn, and you don't. And that was why my suggestion of turning to a church, other family members who may also share in your grief, and maybe they might approach it a little differently. They might be a little more, I'm going to use the word pragmatic. Maybe the death does not affect them the same way, and hopefully they can be of help to you. But for the most part, it is definitely a very individual thing, and if it affects you in a way that is very very emotional, and it doesn't affect others the same way, it does not mean that they are not as emotionally impacted. It's just we all express grief differently. Some people go into denial, and for those individuals, it is merely a way of coping, and there is no sin, there is nothing wrong with that, but it is merely a way of coping, and we all have our own methods. And if you discover that in being in denial for a while, that things begin to surface, you then can avail yourself of the same kinds of help, other family members, meditation. All of these are good tools in order to deal with the loss. And it's also an opportunity to do some reading on grief, because clearly it's impacting you, and it's good that you know that and accept that and embrace it and move forward. And if by all means, if you have difficulty with that, then seek medical attention. And to those that have experienced that, my condolences to you. But I'm going to sign off now. You've been listening to John Johnson, Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And until we meet again, thank you for listening.